You can imagine a situation of a tree falling over and trapping a deer's leg, and that deer spends the rest of its life in confusion and agony until it starves. If Christianity is true and suffering is redeemed, we need an account of this. Now, you could just say this deer goes to heaven. Feels like a bit of a disposal problem to me, but you could say that. There's still an interesting question about whether any being could have the right to do this kind of thing. An interesting point that's raised by David Benatar is that there seems to be a difference between our right to inflict suffering, if it's to prevent further suffering, or if it's to provide good. In other words, if I have to unconsensually inflict suffering upon somebody, but it's the only thing I can do to prevent much greater suffering to them, it seems like I'm justified in doing it. It seems like I have the right to inflict it. If I can break their arm to stop them from drowning because I need to kind of pull them through a gap where water's filling up, I'm allowed to inflict suffering to prevent greater suffering. But if I could break somebody's arm unconsensually, and it doesn't prevent greater suffering, it just gives them something really good. Maybe it gives them like an encyclopedic knowledge of geography, and they want to be a geography professor. Or maybe it just gives them this wonderful feeling of elation, or just some positive good. It seems that unconsensually, I don't have the right to inflict that.
Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today we're watching something intense. Alex O'Connor, one of the sharpest atheist philosophers out there, goes head-to-head with Trent Horn, a Catholic apologist who's known for his philosophical arguments defending Christianity. They're tackling the problem of evil and suffering, and Alex brings up examples that are genuinely hard to answer, from animal suffering in the wild to whether God has the right to inflict pain just because he'll compensate us later. This conversation gets deep fast, and you're going to want to see how it unfolds, because the arguments Alex makes here are some of the most challenging objections to Christian theodicy I've ever heard. Real quick before we start, drop a comment and let me know what city or country you're tuning in from. I genuinely love seeing how far this content reaches. All right, let's jump into this.
Are we glad to find ourselves in a world where there has been this kind of racism so that we can have the good of something like overcoming it with Martin Luther King? Or would we rather live in a world where there were no racism in the first place and no need for Martin Luther King? Forgiveness and compassion, these things are only good insofar as they overcome some evil. I'd rather do without the evil and without the need to overcome it. Saying that it's good to have the evil so that we can get good out of overcoming it is just like saying that we should be very glad of the existence of cancer, because if we didn't have cancer, then we wouldn't be able to reach the good of cancer research and people coming up with chemotherapy. This seems to me ridiculous, and I imagine that you would take problem with that analogy, because surely, at least in the case of something like cancer research, and possibly with the Martin Luther King example, I mean, would you rather live in a world where there had been no racism and no need for Martin Luther King, or in a world where there was racism, so that we get the good of combating racism? That just to me seems bizarre.
I think the way to answer that is to say, well, suppose we lived in an alternative world that did not have racism, but it had every other evil. Perhaps it's a world where everyone belonged to the same race, and we had all the same evils we still have right now. I suspect your probability about God wouldn't change that much, given all the other evils that exist. So there's so many other evils. You'd rather live in a world with or without racism. There's still so many other evils associated with human beings. That question you asked me is like asking, wouldn't the world be better without human beings? Like, surely our world without genocide and rape and human evils, wouldn't the world just be better without human beings? And my answer is no, it would not be better, actually, because humans also bring unique goods with them, and the harm inflicted by the evils can be conquered and overcome. But ultimately, when I hear your protestation, and it's a rightful protestation you have against evil, you speak about it as if it's this objective thing that's wrong, that we have a duty to remove. And I have a hard time squaring that on an atheistic worldview, the views of either there being objective good and objective right and wrong, or of intrinsic human dignity. Humans have this value that non-humans do not have, which informs many of our moral judgments, to prefer human welfare over the welfare of other creatures. So that's the other bright spot in the evil that I can't explain without God.
I feel like this is a misguided objection. The reason is that what I'm doing here is I'm offering what might sometimes be called an internal critique of Christianity. I'm not claiming that there exist objective moral standards. You are. So what I'm saying is that for me, the problem of evil and suffering is not a problem. It's exactly what I expect to find in the world. For the Christian, it is a problem, because you are asserting the existence of objective goodness, and you are asserting the existence of an objectively good God. And so when I say that, like, God wouldn't allow this evil to take place, and you might say, well, as an atheist, how can you even call it evil? Well, this is what I'm asking you to describe, because you're the one claiming that there is an objective moral standard, and I'm saying that if there is an objective moral standard, then these examples of evil and suffering, or apparent evil and suffering, you are required to incorporate these into your worldview of objective morality. I don't know, it's a bit like...
required?
It's a bit like, well, yeah, you must be. If you want to contend that there's a moral God, you need to include within the permissibility of that moral God the suffering that we see in the world, which I think you would trivially agree that that's something that you have to do. But can I just say, it's like, imagine you were having a discussion with like a flat earther or something. Not to make a comparison, I'm not saying this is anything like that.
I've done an episode on flat Earth. It's interesting.
Yeah, I've done the same. It's quite good fun. But I can imagine somebody kind of saying, like, I imagine you're the flat earther and I'm criticizing the flat Earth hypothesis, and I say, well, if the Earth is flat, then how do planes sort of get from this part of the world to this part of the world? That it would seem like it would be ridiculous to suggest that they could fly over this entire huge disk or around the big ice wall at the other side. And you said something like, but I thought you believed in a globe Earth. So, how can you say, that there's a problem with these planes flying around the equator because you believe it's a globe, right? It's like, yeah, but I'm criticizing your position. You think there's the flat Earth, and so you have to explain why you have this, how you solve this problem of the planes going around. So in the same way, when you say you're a Christian, I say I'm an atheist, I say, well, then how do you explain the problem on Christianity of the existence of evil and suffering? And you're saying, well, I thought you were an atheist. Where are you getting this evil and suffering thing from? It's like, well, I'm actually just criticizing your position here. You're the one who has to account for it, not me. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah, I think I see what you're saying, that you're trying to say, well, you could have a worldview that doesn't require objective good or objective evil. You're just saying that the Christian worldview...
This is where Alex absolutely destroys the entire foundation of Christian theodicy, and I need you to understand why this matters so much. When Trent tries to justify evil by saying it creates greater goods, Alex immediately asks, why is Martin Luther King good? Trent says because he overcame racism, and then Alex drops the hammer. Would we rather live in a world where there was never any racism in the first place and no need for MLK, or do we prefer racism existing so we get the heroism of overcoming it? That question should haunt every Christian who uses the greater goods defense. Because the answer is obvious. We would take no racism every single time. Alex makes it even clearer with the cancer analogy, saying we should be glad cancer exists because then we get chemotherapy is absolutely ridiculous. Nobody actually believes that. Nobody would choose a world with cancer just to have the good of curing it. But here's what Trent does, and this is such a common dodge. He tries to shift the scenario. He says, imagine a world without racism, but with every other evil. That completely misses the point. Alex isn't asking about swapping one evil for another. He's asking whether the evil itself is justified by the good that comes from overcoming it. And the answer is clearly no. If you could eliminate the evil and eliminate the need to overcome it, that would be the better world. This completely undermines the idea that God allows suffering because it produces virtues like courage and compassion.
You're not going to adopt it because it has these inconsistencies in it. But I'm not sure that really works, because I still think that there are moral duties being smuggled in here, that you're not just saying, hey, it's really strange that you have this inconsistent view, because people have all kinds of strange, inconsistent views. I mean, I enjoy comic books, and in comic books, there's something called retroactive continuity. It's necessary because comic book plots get totally inconsistent with one another. Superheroes have one power one day, next issue a totally different power. You say, hey, what about this or that? And it's interesting. Well, we don't give it that much of a a second thought. It's not as important. But the idea that I ought to be consistent in how I treat animals, for example, who are in factory farms, or God, if God exists, God ought to act in a certain way. And now, so it seems to me you're still trying to posit, okay, well, there's this contradiction in view here. But if it's my system, if I have the whole system, and then I say, well, Alex, so here are these other elements like God redeeming evil, compensating people with happiness. To me, it's not just you're saying your system's incoherent, because then you say, well, I think the probability of all of this being true is low. And so it's not just an internal critique. You're saying it doesn't map to reality, even if I can make it consistent with other goods, with reasons, with things like that.
Yeah, I'm not saying you can't do this. I think you can. I think you can offer some great responses to the problem of evil, and explain why it is that God would allow evil. The only thing I'm pushing back on is specifically what you said, that me making the case from the problem of evil, the problem of suffering, if you prefer, is somehow a problem because I can't say that there is objective evil in the world. I don't need to. All I need to say is that if there is such thing as objective morality, it needs to offer an account of what would become these evils, this kind of suffering. Then it would need to offer an account. So I say it's not a problem for me. It's a problem for you. I'm not saying you can't do that.
Right.
I'm just saying that it's not right to say that I can't really make this criticism because I don't believe in objective morality. I'm saying you believe in objective morality,
right.
So you need to offer an account of how objective morality will permit the kind of evils and sufferings that we see. For example, animal suffering, which is potentially the best thing to talk about. Now, when I speak about animal suffering, I'm not talking about the suffering that we inflict upon animals in factory farms, because this is quite easy to explain. Human beings are free creatures, they're sinful creatures. They commit horrendous evils. What I'm talking about is the suffering of animals in the wild. You can imagine a situation of a tree falling over and trapping a deer's leg, and that deer spends the rest of its life in confusion and agony until it starves.
Trent is trying so hard here to turn this around on Alex, and it completely backfires. He's saying that Alex is smuggling in moral duties even though he doesn't believe in objective morality. But Alex shuts this down perfectly, and this is something people need to understand about internal critiques. When Alex points out the problem of evil, he's not claiming there is objective evil in the world. He's saying if Christianity is true and if objective morality exists, then you need to explain how that morality permits the suffering we see. That's not smuggling anything in, that's holding Christians accountable to their own framework. It's like when you're arguing with someone about their political system and you point out internal contradictions. You're not endorsing their system, you're showing them where it breaks down on its own terms. Alex even says he thinks Christians can offer responses to the problem of evil. He's not saying it's impossible. He's just asking Trent to do it. And then he shifts to the strongest example possible: animal suffering in the wild. This is brilliant because you can't use the free will defense here. Humans didn't cause a tree to fall on a deer's leg. There's no sin involved. There's no greater purpose being served. It's just pure, pointless agony. A deer trapped under a tree, slowly starving to death in confusion and pain. What Christian theodicy accounts for that?
If Christianity is true and suffering is redeemed, we need an account of this. Now, you could just say this deer goes to heaven. Feels like a bit of a disposal problem to me, but you could say that. There's still an interesting question about whether any being could have the right to do this kind of thing. An interesting point that's raised by David Benatar is that there seems to be a difference between our right to inflict suffering, if it's to prevent further suffering, or if it's to provide good. In other words, if I have to unconsensually inflict suffering upon somebody, but it's the only thing I can do to prevent much greater suffering to them, it seems like I'm justified in doing it. It seems like I have the right to inflict it. If I can break their arm to stop them from drowning because I need to kind of pull them through a gap where water's filling up, I'm allowed to inflict suffering to prevent greater suffering. But if I could break somebody's arm unconsensually, and it doesn't prevent greater suffering, it just gives them something really good. Maybe it gives them like an encyclopedic knowledge of geography, and they want to be a geography professor. Or maybe it just gives them this wonderful feeling of elation, or just some positive good. it seems that unconsensually, I don't have the right to inflict that. Even if it's something that's kind of going to make them better off, even if they would say that they'd rather have an encyclopedic knowledge of geography rather than have a functioning arm for a while, I can't unconsensually inflict this suffering to bring about a great good in the way that I can inflict a suffering to bring about a great evil. So there's an interesting question about, even if we are being compensated for our suffering, whether or not somebody should have the right to inflict that suffering just on the grounds that it's going to be compensated for. There's a club called the Bullingdon Club, which is famous in Oxford for being this kind of depraved gang of teenage Etonites. The kind of people who end up going on to be our prime ministers. Boris Johnson and David Cameron were both members of this club. It has a reputation for these young, rich kids, before they were in the public eye, they go for dinner and they would just trash the place. They would be completely, they'd cause a racket. They would rip the place apart. They'd flip over the tables. They'd tear down the wallpaper. And the idea was they were so rich that what they would do is they would just throw some money at the person who owned the place and throw them way more money than the meal was worth and way more money than it takes to fix up the place, as if to say, like, yeah, you're going to be fine with this because, yeah, sure, we came into your place and we disrespected you and we completely wrecked your restaurant, but we've just paid you enough money to fix it and then some. I still think that they've wronged them, even if they've compensated them for something. As long as it's being done unconsensually and in a way that a person, doesn't get a say in, I still think they've done something wrong there, even if they're being compensated. And that's even if we grant that these animals will be compensated in the afterlife, that there is such thing as a dear heaven, which I must say I'm quite skeptical of. If there's not, we've got an even bigger problem. How on earth can we explain the meaning behind the suffering of this deer with its leg trapped under the tree that's starving in confused agony? I don't know what you would say.
The deer example is devastating, but what Alex does next is even more philosophically powerful. He brings up David Benatar's consent principle, and this is where the entire compensation theodicy falls apart. Here's the distinction. You can inflict suffering on someone without their consent if it's to prevent greater suffering. Breaking someone's arm to pull them through a gap before they drown, that's justified. But can you inflict suffering just to give them some positive good later? Can you break their arm so they gain encyclopedic knowledge of geography? Absolutely not. And that's exactly what God is doing according to Christian theology. He's inflicting suffering not to prevent worse suffering, but to provide compensation later in heaven. Even if we grant that animals go to heaven and are compensated, which Alex is skeptical of, and honestly, so am I, there's still a fundamental violation happening. You don't have the right to harm someone just because you're going to make it up to them later. Then comes the Bullingdon Club analogy, and this is where it gets visceral. These wealthy Oxford students would trash restaurants, destroy property, disrespect the owners, and then throw money at them afterward. Way more money than the damage cost. Does that make it okay? Of course not. We recognize that as a grotesque display of power and entitlement. When human beings do that to other human beings, we call it a violation. We call it treating people as property. So why should we accept it when God does it to his creation? The fact that he can compensate us doesn't mean he has the right to inflict the suffering in the first place. This completely dismantles the idea that heaven makes everything okay. Compensation doesn't erase the moral problem of unconsented harm. So what do you guys think of this? Leave your thoughts down in the comments. Please like and subscribe, and I will see you in the next video.